Well, hello, everybody. We are glad that you're here to join us for our September Roundtable. We're missing one of our editors, Randy. She's not feeling well and had really some things that we just couldn't finally get around as far as scheduling goes. And so it'll just be the four of us today, but we're going to talk about instruction, about listening, and what good listening looks like. Our passage for this month, as you know, if you've read any of the articles, really comes from Proverbs, the first chapter, when Solomon begins to give the admonitions to listen. Verses 8 and 9 say, "My son, hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother, for they are a graceful ornament on your head and chains about your neck." So this admonition, of course, refers to instruction, giving instruction, but it also refers to the ears of the listener. So it implies two things, really. Number one, that someone is responsible to instruct, and number two, that someone is responsible to listen, to hear. And of course, instruction can come in various forms, in teaching and example and in casual conversation. It can also be received in various ways. It can be received with understanding. It can then become a defining thing for your character, or it can bring rebellion or even just dismissal and ignoring and pretending that it has not been given. I want to explore really both roles this morning, the giver and the receiver, in our roundtable discussion today. Instruction is just really simply defined in a secular dictionary, is defined as knowledge or information imparted. So instruction can be good or bad. It can be based on truth or fiction. It can be appropriate or inappropriate. Instruction, most of the time, actually, is tedious. It can be burdensome at times. That's why we skip instruction manuals. You ever assembled something? Maybe you're better at instruction manuals than your husband's or the men in your life. And a lot of times that's thought to be true. But you've got these instruction manuals for assembling toys or bikes or furniture, and you end up with a few extra screws or springs or a couple of extra washers at the end if instructions are not really carefully followed. And giving instruction is labor. It's work. I used to write policy and procedure in my government work years ago. It's a job. It took work and much examination to be sure that what I was writing would serve well those who would follow it. As Lee mentioned in her article, much of the time, instruction demands a reaction from us. Much of the time, it demands a restart. When you're assembling something and you look and you've got this long piece of steel or some piece of and you go back and you look at that instruction and it was 4 steps ago. You may have to restart. You may have to reassemble something. You have to readjust your plans. It can cause additional effort on our part, as policy does. And it always demands obedience in order to get it right. So continuing a study in Proverbs, it becomes clear that the instruction referred to in the first chapter is that of wise counsel, with the wisest sources being that birth of it, and instruction that one is urged to hear and wear as graceful ornaments. It's the glory of our life, the instruction that is talked about. It is folly and death that comes when you disregard such instruction that's being discussed in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs 4, in verse 1, "Hear, my children, the instruction of your father, and give attention and know understanding." That is what we get with good instruction. Proverbs 4 and 13, "Take firm hold of instruction. Do not let go. Keep her, for she is your life." Proverbs 5 and 23, "He shall die from lack of instruction." and in the greatness of his folly shall go astray. A disregard for instruction is discussed. In 8:33, hear instruction and be wise, do not disdain it. In chapter 10 and verse 17, he who keeps instruction is in the way of life, but he who refuses instruction goes astray. And so it continues on. It is certainly one of the embedded strengths of Proverbs. Wise instruction is to be carried out and embedded on the hearts belonging to God's children. Throughout the history of God's people, this instruction was to be followed, and it was expected. And it was anticipated that it would come first from him, from God, the Almighty, the great I am. And then reinforcement of his instruction would come through the fathers and the mothers of his nation. That is God's expectation. The children were to honor their fathers and their mothers. That was one of the commands, listening with good ears in order to hear and obey the instructions. The parents were to repeat and instill the instructions given by God, the knowledge, the wisdom imparted through the law. And that's, of course, the passage in Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter that many of us are familiar with, that we are to write them on our doorpost. We are to discuss them in our homes, that this is the instruction that is implied through this passage. And yet, we have to address the reality in a discussion such as this. For as we know, it seems that even that expectation has flaws because men and women are involved. And we can read throughout the history of God's people, prophets and kings and even high priests throughout the centuries who demonstrated a lack of that teaching and instruction. Or they had children who were rebellious or defiant to wise instruction. It's perhaps even more interesting to think about the children who, despite evil and unwise parental instruction and examples, they turned their hearts towards God and wise counsel and the instruction of God. Those such as Asa and Josiah and Hezekiah, in contrast to Eli's children and Samuel's children and David's children. And so how do we reconcile that knowledge and that understanding of those examples for us, and even examples in our own life that we see, to this poetic language of the book of Proverbs? You know, our world is full of ungodly instruction. And even parents can give unwise instruction. What if our children do not receive wise instruction? What if we do give wise instructions and they don't receive it? It's really quite simple, isn't it? We see all of that within the boundaries of the inspired scripture. Wise instruction should be given by God's children who are parents. Wise counsel should be received by those of us who would know God, by wise parents, or through the instruction of the scriptures. There's a way for all men and women to wear wise instruction of God as ornaments of decoration. And since that is the case, much discussion must be given on how well we listen, how well we obey, how well we understand, and how well we wear wise ornaments and wise instruction, and then how well we impart it. And as was discussed in several of our monthly articles, listening becomes the challenge. Good listening leads to obeying, it leads to wearing it, and it leads to properly passing it on. So Lee, I'm going to start with you because of the fact that you wrote one of the articles this month and you talked about the trouble with good listening. So let's just start with that, and that it demands a response. It demands us to listen without our own agendas, that we don't listen with our minds already made up. And we can't listen to two conversations at once. So I'm just going to let you talk through some of your thoughts actually from your article this week as we begin this discussion on instruction and how it's used in our lives.
Okay, great. Yeah. I think that you know, I mean, any secular studies about listening mention the same ideas that we've talked about, that listening is something that most people are really just not very good at by nature. It is a selfless act, and most of us, even those who are quiet and attentive, in their minds, they're often not really listening and attending to the conversation, that we have to put ourselves aside and we're not just waiting for the opportunity to insert our own opinions or give our own experience or something like that, to listen without judgment, to really hear and understand is not something that we're good at. And we often even ask questions that we don't listen to the answers to. I mean, I don't know how many times you've done this, but you've asked someone how they're doing and they reply fine, and then you reply fine, thanks, even though they didn't say how are you. They hadn't asked how you were doing. I do it all the time, and I don't guess that's really having an agenda necessarily, but I'm just going through the daily niceties of inquiring, but I don't hear the response. I'm not paying attention. I have an expectation of how this conversation is going to go, and so I just reply without having been asked. And I think we can do the same thing with God's word if we're not careful. We know what it says, we know what to expect, we know the way the story ends, and so we stop listening. And I think that's when our ears grow dull. One of the passages that I talked about in the article is in Hebrews, where the Hebrews writer says, I have more to talk to you about these things, but you can't listen to them, you can't hear them, you are dull of hearing, and we no longer hear the power of the message, and we can't mature, we can't grow, we can lose our conviction and our ability to impart the truth, to be the other part of that conversation. I think it's a really easy thing for us to do, which is scary. I think I ended up writing about 4 different versions of this article because I had a hard time focusing. One of the things that I looked at was just the different kinds of references to ears there are in the scriptures. It's the parable of the sower is what I settled on, because I think it involves all of those kinds of listeners. It encompasses all of those who hear the truth. And I think it's really interesting that 3 of the hearers mentioned do hear the truth, at least at some level. The soil by the wayside is really the only one that just won't hear any of it. But even that is a response. The truth demands that we respond to it in one way or another. One of the reasons that Jesus taught in parables was because as the people were listening, they're judging, they're making judgments as they go. The wicked may dismiss it, but that doesn't change the truth of the argument. We can alter it, and we can put words in God's mouth and fool ourselves into thinking that he will understand why we're doing what we want to do. But the truth hasn't changed. And that was the problem for the rich young ruler in his conversation with Jesus. And it was the problem for Agrippa when Paul reasoned with him. And it was what convicted the crowd on the day of Pentecost, that once we hear it, the truth demands that we decide what we're going to do with it. I have a study going on during the week on the book of John, which is, of course, all about what we're going to do with the truth. The evidence of converting the soul is John's whole point. And the conversation I had a few weeks ago was, what do we do with all of this information? And the question was, what do you do with what Jesus says? Where do you go next? Once you've heard it, what do you do? And my answer was, that's the decision that everybody makes. Once you've heard it, you decide how you're going to approach it. You can dismiss it, but you can't hide from it. You can push it aside, but there's nowhere to go but to do something. And if you dismiss it, then you have to deal with the fact that you've dismissed it. And so you have to understand, too, that if you decide that this is where you're going to plant your flag, so to speak. This is where you're going to live your life, that it's going to cost you something. And just like every other choice we make in our lives, we have to decide if it's worth it. And the answer is either yes, it is, or no, it's not. But that decision isn't the last one that we'll make about the truth, because we have to understand then that we listen without our own agendas. And we come to it in order to hear it so that it will lead to obedience, which is really the only response. I started to, our dad used to tell a story in his sermon. It's not very complimentary of me, but he used to describe the way people listen to things and the way they deal with rules by talking about his three daughters. And he talked about the fact that when he would give instruction, his oldest daughter would listen to it and do it because it was what he had said to do. And his middle daughter, who is on here as well, would listen to it and weigh it and think about it and then determine if that was the right instruction and if it was moral and if it was good. And then she would keep that instruction. And his youngest daughter, which was me, while he was giving instruction, he said he could watch me thinking there's got to be a way around that idea that I was listening with my own agenda. I was already decided that was not something I was terribly interested in, and I would just disregard it. I really thought rules were for people who didn't have their own plans. And so that was the way he described us. And he was joking, sort of, but it is just another indicator of how we listen, I'm sure it worried him greatly that he knew that about my nature. But like we were talking about children who listen to instruction, if we have earthly fathers who listen to the Heavenly Father, then we are lucky if we listen to them. But it is about how we hear the truth and what we're going to do with it. We can all look for loopholes and minimums in God's word, but then I would argue we've already stopped listening. We have an answer that we want in our heads already, and we're going to figure out a way to make it work for us. And Paul calls these itching ears. So there's the other problem of hearing, that another kind of ears. These are these are the ears that are just looking for something to ease the discomfort of the truth. And I think this is that idea of listening to one conversation at a time. I said in my article that I hate sitting in the middle of a table, a big conversation, because I end up not listening to anything. I can't hear any conversation. It's way too overwhelming for me. And we can have itching ears, this idea that we want to listen to two conversations at the same time. We want to make God's word and the message of the world fit. And it just doesn't. It won't. We water down the truth so that it's easier for us to deal with. And we can do this by not taking a strong stand with our friends on topics of morality, or in our workplace, making compromises where we shouldn't. We can do it with our children by allowing them to do and see things that they really shouldn't, because we look harsh and overly strict if we don't kind of cave in to some of those things. We hear, but we don't listen. We try to merge those two messages. And I think that's a real danger for us, to try and walk that line. Over and over, we're cautioned about trying to listen to two conversations. To go back to the parable of the sower, that's really the problem with the rocky and the thorny soil. They have too many other ideas in the ground with them. The rocky soil has no depth. There's this emotional response that's initial. Much of the Christian world continues to try to feed this piece of faith, the conversation that somehow worship is about us, how we feel, how we respond. So many denominational churches try to grasp on to that desire in people, and they just provide the feel good. It's effective, I suppose. They've got churches full of people, but they're people who, when the sun comes out and the heat is on, they have no depth. there's no challenging content. There's nothing that causes change. The thorny soil is really the same. The idea that you can have the foot in the world, one foot in the world of man and one in the foot in the world of God, that we can listen to both. The world's message is that you can listen to both, that you can have this piece of God and this piece of the world and make them fit, but Jesus says you can't. And we're just kidding ourselves if we think we can live that way. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that our churches are populated with rocky and thorny soil. We just have to make sure. I referenced Amy's article on the sword, that the sword of the Spirit, that we turn it inward first, that we look at ourselves. We have to be able to see what kind of soil our hearts really are. Because, the good news is the thorny soil doesn't have to remain thorny. We can choose to have open ears. Psalms 40, David talks about the fact that God has opened his ears and made him see that he doesn't desire sacrifices, that he desires a heart that has God's law written upon it. We can decide, we can weed our gardens. We can turn the sword in on ourselves and choose to only hear one conversation. We can turn off the channels of the others, and we can put our own agendas aside, and we can put our own 2 cents worth, our own understanding aside. If we need to do those things, then we've got some yard work we need to do by turning that sword inward first. And then that's really when we have the message, when we have the challenging content. But we have to be able to turn everything else off and not be fooled by the message of the world. So,
yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's a good way for us to start this conversation, is that, really, in order to impart good wisdom, we have to be able to receive good wisdom and good counsel and then act upon it. So Jillian, I'm gonna go to you next. I had Randy saddled in here, but she's not here, and I'll talk a little bit about what I was going to ask her about at the very end, if it's not already been covered by everybody. But so let's assume we've heard and we've chosen, or we say we've chosen, sometimes that may be it, to follow, maybe even without a full understanding. Obviously we understand that sometimes we don't fully understand, but we've decided we'll follow that instruction, the wise instruction of God, the wise instruction of our godly parents, if we have them, or sometimes it's former generations or our peers who have taught us things and instructed us. That many times is the way we come to this wise instruction. So talk about what wearing that instruction looks like. In the scripture that we looked at this month, it talks about it being those wonderful ornaments that we wear around our neck and on our head. And what does that look like? And how do our lives demonstrate to others that we've received wise instruction and that we nobly wear it, that we wear it for righteousness' sake? And how can we ensure that is a demonstration for others?
So thank you. I actually love this question so much because I love that imagery in that verse. Again, I'll read it again real quick. My son, hear the instruction of your father and do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head and chains about your neck. So this phrase, to wear godly instruction as a graceful ornament on your head, here suggests that we should hold and display wisdom from God's teaching as proudly and visibly as one would actually wear a beautiful piece of jewelry or a crown. And I feel like this means so much more, thinking about, again, who was writing this. So this was likely Solomon, a king. So somebody that likely knew a thing or two about wearing a crown proudly. Sorry. So when we talk about wearing godly instruction like a crown or a piece of regal jewelry, it means we should hold God's teaching close. We should value them highly, and we should let them guide our actions, just as these items would have signaled a high status or loyalty in their historical contexts. We should be proud to show our commitment to living according to God's wisdom. So I want to head over to Psalms and read a few verses from there. So Psalm 63, verses 1-5, I'm going to read. And it talks about, it really articulates, I feel like, the deep yearning that we should have for this wisdom of God. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than my life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. So this is talking about how we should, again, as we were talking about, it's not just, oh, I sat there and listened to this, or I heard it. It's that we're not only hearing it, but we're earnestly seeking that type of wisdom. We're thirsting for it. This godly instruction provides us with a compass, pointing us towards righteousness, even when we may not fully understand it, which again, I think, Liz, you may have referenced this verse, Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, which again, this is how we wear it. And he will make your path straight. This verse highlights the significance of trusting in God's wisdom over our own human understanding. So wearing godly instruction is not just about our own growth. It's also about demonstrating to others that we know God, we love God, and we're living our daily lives as he has taught us to. And this is, again, where I feel like it comes with the wearing that he was talking about. In Matthew 5:16, it says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Our actions, guided by God's instruction, become a testament of our faith, and they can lead others towards the path of righteousness. So they see us wearing this. And again, I think this is the beautiful part. When we wear our godly instruction, it positively impacts our relationships with God and with others. In John 13, verses 34-35, it says, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. This scripture emphasizes that our actions, guided by God's wisdom, should be rooted in love, fostering deeper and more meaningful relationships. Again, this is, I feel like, how we wear this instruction. So I wanted to end just on a practical note. So because I've been writing a lot of blog posts lately, so I feel like ending it on here are 3 things that we can do. So what are 3 ways that we can wear this crown daily? I think the one and the main one is through regular prayer and study of his word. Doing so allows us to really internalize these teachings and apply them in our lives. But also, again, I'm not a mom, but I do have little ones in my life. And I feel like them seeing us doing this, praying and studying regularly, that's also wearing of the instruction. So letting them see our light shine. So the second way, through service to others, acts of kindness and charity are tangible manifestations of godly instruction. As we serve others, we become living examples of God's love. So again, people see you. People see what you're doing. They see you serving. And again, this is a way that we wear this crown proudly. Through sharing, and the third way is through sharing of the word. Discussing scripture with others not only deepens our own understanding, but also helps spread God's wisdom. It's through sharing that we demonstrate our commitment to living out these instructions. So, wise instruction and really hearing it and wearing it from God is a gift that guides us towards this righteous path. As we hear it and wear it, we become a beacon of God's love and wisdom, positively influencing everyone around us. So let's wear this proudly and let's let it shape us into who we are wanting to be. So anyways,
That's
that is
great.
my 2
Yeah,
cents on that.
Yeah, you made some great points. I think, in fact, while you were talking, not that I wasn't listening, I actually was listening, but it did trigger me thinking, because the way you started was really great in the sense that it's imagery about what we wear. It is interesting in our culture, but I think in all cultures, and even in biblical text, we know that what someone wears defines them. And we know that, I tell a story in one of my classes about little bitty things. There was a girl that worked with me at DC, and she bought a little purse, like it was this big, and it had some kind of special initials, and it was some fancy, she had spent 100, and somebody was telling her that just says her all over it, that it just looks like her in it. But little bitty things define us. Can you imagine a crown? Like you said,
Right.
somebody that understood
Well,
what a crown, wearing a crown.
Exactly, that understood, had a whole thing of jewelry he could be wearing,
Yeah.
and what that signifies to the others. And I loved Matthew Henry's commentary on this as well, because he was really taking it back to, I guess, Middle Ages, on the collars that they would wear to, with these huge chains, to again signify who they were and what they were doing. And say, like, again, the imagery of that, I just feel like is great.
Yeah.
So,
and that it defines who you are.
and
when
whose you are. Yeah.
Whose you are. Yeah.
Yep.
We went to Israel, and I found one of the fascinating things about Jerusalem was you could tell what sect of the Jews they were part of because of the hats that they wore, and so we understand this. We all get this. Americans are great at having little emblems on their shirts that tell what brand it is, and that brand somehow defines that person, in the sense of, oh, well, I can tell who that is, or I can tell who that is. And so we get this. It's wonderful. Great comments, Jillian. We appreciate it. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's really good. So Amy, I want you to talk a little bit today, and then I'll follow up with a few comments on Randy's piece a little bit. But finally, we get to the point where we say, okay, so who are those godly parents? Who is giving this instruction? We've talked about listening. Lee talked a lot about good listeners. Several of our articles talked about that. But there are two responsible parties in this text. And one is, and David certainly gave Solomon some really wise counsel at the end of his life, on his deathbed. So the responsibility of godly parents are really just even older generations, like Jillian. Jillian will give wise counsel to her nieces and nephews. We all give wise counsel to the children in our congregations. None of my grandchildren are in my congregation, but I spend a lot of time teaching younger generations to instill that instruction in the hearts of our children and our future generations. So what do we offer our younger generations as decorations and crowns to wear in their lifetimes? We are competing, as silly as it seems, with that shirt with the alligator on. We're competing with wearing something that defines them differently. So how important is that responsibility to know wisdom, to impart instruction? Why is it so hard for us to do? And is there a guarantee that our younger children will listen and respond accurately, and then wear those? That's a big question.
So it is a big question. I'm not sure I feel adequate to the task, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So I think I want to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 really quick first, and start in chapter 6, verse 5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk to them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates. And that passage starts in verse 4 with, listen, Israel. And so I think it's interesting because one of our first things is we have to listen. We can't provide, just like what you've said all along, we can't provide any sort of good guidance if we're also not listening. And so then Moses goes on to instruct them, what you've heard then, it's your job to now pass these along. And I think what's interesting is he didn't say, when you come to the tabernacle, that's when you can get it. And I'm not saying those things are bad. We, of course, go to church. There is a purpose and a point to that. But what Moses listed was everyday things, right? When you're just walking along, or when it's time to lie down, or when you get up, or right. And they should be just as Jillian was talking about decorations, they should be decorations in your life, right? They should be everywhere. Something something should remind you to talk to your kids about in almost anything, right? Sometimes, right, when you're on vacation and you see a beautiful sunrise, well, who made that, right? And let's talk about that. So I think that's what Moses is getting at, is he's saying this isn't just a, once a week sort of thing. This is every single day of your life. You're working on these things with your children. But I think something that's really critical, that we can talk a lot, but our example is honestly probably the biggest words that they're hearing. And so I'll be honest, I feel so blessed to have been raised in a godly home, and not even just my parents, but grandparents. I have a granddaddy. He has passed away, but I distinctly remember as a child, he would, this sounds funny, but he would sit there and shave with an electric razor and read his Bible. That's what you saw him doing every single morning you got up. He had Multi-Meal, I think, every morning with his electric razor and the Bible. That's how you saw him every morning. It just didn't matter what was going on. And my grandmommy, who was his wife, my parents would go out of town. They'd come watch us. I can remember having real deep conversations with things I didn't feel comfortable even talking to my parents about. And I'd ask my grandmommy about this, and she never flew off the handle and was like, what are you even thinking? If that was not her response, she would sit down and talk about those things with me. Both of my parents are incredibly godly parents. That doesn't mean they're perfect. Not one of those 4 people I just talked about were perfect, but they did their best, and they did provide amazing examples to me. It wasn't just that they were talking to me about it, they lived it. They actually believed it. And I find something interesting. You mentioned David passing on wisdom. And I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to bash David. This is a story for me, because I think David was a man after God's own heart. And there's danger here, because yes, David did give Solomon some really good instruction at the end of his life, but he also gave him some interesting instructions too, about here's how you make sure you keep this kingdom politically. In addition, for all the things he said, I sometimes wonder, why did Solomon go marry so many wives? Well, he had an example of that in his father, who also gathered some wives politically. And again, that is not to say that, of course, we are told he's a man after God's own heart, but we are also told he made mistakes. And I think we can't underestimate the power of that influence on our children, right? That the things that they're picking up that we may not even realize they're picking up, which is a little bit scary sometimes. The other thing I really wanted to talk about, so when we were talking about these decorations, and this is just briefly, I loved everything Jillian and Liz talked about there. One thing I did want to point out, though, is that there is a beauty aspect to these. So even little girls want to go get tiaras, right? And they want to wear that around because they think it's beautiful. Well, the thing that I want to stress on this is that these decorations that are being talked about by Solomon are beautiful. And real beauty, right, comes from putting on these instructions. And we even recognize this, just to your point, Liz, we recognize this looking around the world, right? That we could see somebody that appears to be gorgeous, right? I mean, that person is physically beautiful. And all of a sudden, as you get to know them, you think, they're not quite as beautiful to me anymore, because they're demonstrating something different, right? Their actions and the way they treat people and how they live isn't as beautiful as, right, what we first perceived. Or the opposite can work, that maybe somebody you meet, you think is maybe not as beautiful, but then you get to know them and you think, wow, they might be the most beautiful person I know. We can be influenced by the decorations of their life, right? That's what's showing real beauty. And I think even instructing our kids on that, what is real beauty? Because they are being called to from the world. We've talked about this in Proverbs, right? That there are these 2 competing women standing on the corners. One is wisdom and she's calling, but one is folly. And look, we're fooling ourselves if we don't think folly looks pleasant and good to go after. We're not being realistic parents if we think there isn't something to that siren call, right? And in some ways, I think a little bit about, why am I blanking? The Odyssey, right? In the Odyssey, Homer is told to, Homer describes that Odysseus is told to go by the sirens, and he says, you better bind yourself up, right? Like, stop up your ears, don't listen. And so he makes all the men do this, but it's interesting to me that he says, yeah, I want to hear it, but just bind me up, right? Get me really tight. There's playing with fire there, right? Actually, we should be noticing that a little bit about Odysseus, that he's kind of playing with fire. Like, oh, I still want to hear it. I would enjoy, but I don't want to cause myself any distress. I think one of the things we try to teach our kids is stop up your ears, right? Just please don't play with fire that way. And don't listen to the siren call of the world. That is danger, right? And it will cause destruction. That's actually what the point was. You will be destroyed if you listen to those calls. And so I think even in little things like that, we can read stories with our kids and say, well, what were the morals in that? What should that character have done? What same thing for the Bible, right? When you're reading it together, ask your kids. You will be shocked sometimes at the things they'll come out with that you maybe you haven't even thought about with these characters, and how to think through them. But I think it's those little things that will make the odds better. So to your last question, is it a guarantee? No, we're all humans that have our own minds and we can make up our own choices. I have seen many times very godly parents that unfortunately their children chose to listen to the siren calls, right? And they went a different way. And so there isn't a guarantee, but all we can do is try to live our lives in such a way and talk to our kids in such a way that we're at least giving them the best advice we can. And I would also end that with saying, having some humility and being willing to tell your kids, I know I'm not perfect, right? I'm a human just like you, and I'm working through this. But at the end of the day, I desperately love God and I'm trying. And that's what I would hope for you too. So that's about all I can, I pray that my children will heed and listen. They are still not out of my home yet, but that's what I can do, right? I can pray to the Lord about it and provide the best simple guidance I can.
Absolutely. I think that's great. And there aren't any guarantees, but there are promises to God's people. And I think parents walk that fine line of understanding that their child has a free will. And yet the promise is there that if we do instill those things in them, that there is a great hope that they will do what they have seen and heard. So I really was just going to talk to Randy. Randy was just going to talk a little bit about how does obedience work then as a demonstration of our listening and our hearing instruction properly. You know, the fact that everything that we've talked about today, that we don't always understand instruction. We don't always get it right away. And we don't always understand why instruction is given the way that it is. And so we don't always understand the instruction of our parents, of our elders, but more importantly, even those of us who are older and have for many years tried to be obedient to God, we still don't always understand the instruction that's given. And so I was going to talk a little bit to Randy about how maturity changes our understanding of godly instruction as we grow both in spirit and truth. And I think it's a good way to end our conversation today. Amy's right. We are just finishing up on a study about David and his heart with the ladies here. And he is a real, in many ways, an enigma to us. We challenge ourselves by studying David's life. But David did give Solomon some solemn and righteous instruction just before death. And it was mixed in with a lot of the political and reality of their world advice as well. But it is seen that Solomon is somewhat responsive. He understands that he falls short of an understanding of true wisdom. And in both David and Solomon's life, and I have to say, I don't struggle with David as much as my son-in-law really struggles with him, and I get all of that. And I know Amy does too at times. But here's the thing, they're flawed and they're people, but both of them seem to, Solomon at a much later time, I think, and experiences a lot. Of course, his life is very different than his father's as well. But they both do continually come back to that source. And there's maturity, growth in all of our lives. And I think as an older person, what David gives me is the ability to know that I am going to make mistakes. I'm going to make judgment calls that I look back on and wonder about. I'm going to be flawed. I'm going to stumble. I'm going to not always be objective when it comes to my children. I'm not always going to give proper, he gives me a lot of strength as I examine my own life. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how instruction changes and our response to instruction changes and our understanding of instruction changes as we just get older and we perhaps mature and perhaps we stumble even. And that instruction doesn't always make sense to us. By the way, we don't always heed it, and we don't always fully translate it well. And so what do we do with ourselves when we get to be 60 or 80 and we look back on instruction that we gathered wisely, that we heard well, that we obeyed well, and instruction that we had to learn through our own mistakes and our own misfortunes? And I think you come to the end of your life with a combination of all of that when it comes to instruction. And sometimes instruction doesn't make sense at the time. I think Lee talked about that, Daddy talking about it. And instruction, I always struggled with instruction in the sense that I wanted it to make sense to me, that I wanted to be able to see that outcome. And sometimes we can't with God's instruction or even our parents' instruction until well after the fact, after we've assembled that life as a result of the instruction given. And we easily see this when we return to those instructions when we are building a bike or when we're building a piece of furniture, and we return back to those instructions because we've sort of ventured off on our own, thinking that we understand the end product and that we know what I know what a bicycle looks like, so surely I can put this together without this instruction book. We get all of that, and there are times when we venture out on our own and we go ahead and put the wheel on, but we've forgotten to put the pieces that make that wheel work. And so we get this. And sometimes it's impossible for us to see how things work together for good, that we just have to blindly follow that instruction book. The end result, if the instructions are followed carefully, is a sturdy and a useful bike or dresser, chest of drawers, or a bedside table, because we have gone back to that instruction book and we've followed it well and we've carefully examined it and we've overcome those errors and mistakes because we've restarted or we've re-engaged. And as we mature, the more we reference the instructions and the more we have referenced the instructions in our lives, and we find ourselves following those instructions to be easier. And we even learn to follow them without thinking through each step. We don't start back at the beginning of every instruction. I don't have to rethink the reason why I do things, that I already have that established within my life. That instruction is there. It's embedded in me. It's the foundation of my life because the instruction book is tattered with wear. Like Amy said, I bet her granddaddy's Bible, which he shaved over every day, was tattered and worn. It's tabbed as an immediate resource. You go back to those resources. I have tabs in my Bible that I know it's that yellow torn tab. Just go back there. And we've made much of that instruction manual that's embedded in our minds. And we can even instruct others who don't have that instruction manual at their disposal or haven't used that instruction manual throughout their lives. And we can even guide someone in that instruction without going back to our book always, but because it's there in our heads and it's there in our hearts and that we've made those mistakes. David knew of the mistakes that he had made. I even think about that time in his life where he's lived in that Philistine city and answered to a king of the enemy. And I think about how he must have gone through the processes of that time in his life. And we continually draw ourselves back to that instruction book, and we take that wheel off and we start over again. And then we come around full circle as parents and elders and older people who can easily impart wise counsel if the instructions have been used to live well and wisely. And our own lives are built upon a foundation and an instruction manual that is well worn and well tabbed and well referred to. And as a result, our children, our younger church families, our youth, our newly baptized believers will have good and proper instruction as God intended to follow a secure, to follow and have a securely well-built life. Our bicycles work, they propel us. Our furniture stores well the needs that we have in our lives. And if we choose to hear it, if we choose to live it, if we choose to obey it, then we begin to have those lives that demonstrate that, and we can pass that on to future generations. And that was kind of what I had thought that we would do in the direction of Randy. You know, it's a natural thing. We're gonna veer off sometimes from the instruction book, and maturity will help us with that. And we're going to get better, or we hope we get better. I will tell you this, if you still struggle with the fundamental instructions, you need to get with it. You got to do better than that. We just have to be further along in understanding our instruction manual. And maturity should do that for us. And if we're not maturing in this instruction manual, and every single time we're offered that sin, we have to go back and start, something's up. We're not heeding that instruction well enough to, like Amy said, live it as examples of living examples. Wear it, as Jillian talked about, that crown, and not rethink and have our own agenda like Lee talked about today.
Well, and I was thinking, sorry to interrupt, but when
No, go
Amy
ahead.
and Jillian were both talking, one of the things we have to understand is that we instruct.
Yes.
One way or the other. Our lives are instruction. And I do think it gets easier with maturity, it's easier to listen to instruction if we've also been the one who gives instruction, wise instruction, then wise instruction, like you were saying, it becomes a natural habit, but you are instructing. Not instructing's not an option. Your life teaches something. People see you're adorned with something. You've got something on your head, you know. I mean, and like Amy was saying, it's a daily thing. If your children, if their entire spiritual instruction is that 40 minutes of Bible class on Sunday morning, then you've not given them the best platform. Your instruction then during the week discounts whatever has been done. That was all I was thinking, is that we are instructing. Everybody is.
Well, and like I was trying to say at the very beginning, it's tedious, it's hard. You know, I used to write policy and procedure, and getting all those steps in is hard, and it can be tedious, and it takes patience. That's why we disregard instruction books that have 7 pages, because that's way too much, and we know where all the screws should be, and we end up with an extra spring somewhere, and we think, what in the world? That can't mean much. And yet it does. You know, the whole entire gear is driven by that spring. And so we see all that in life. And yet we can't be patient enough to wait on God's instruction to do what it needs to do in our lives so that we can then properly instruct. And Lee's right. You are instructing something. I'm going to tell you something. As a parent, it is tedious. It is hard. What Amy's talking about is you're exhausted by the end of the day. You don't feel like doing it anymore, but you not doing it is also instruction. And so it is something that we have to take very, very seriously. And it is it is glorious to wear, like what Jillian was saying, it is described as something, and Amy mentioned, of great beauty. If we are to wear that instruction properly, it is just fabulous. And it's not just our children who will be served well by us following that instruction. Going back, repairing the damage we've done without it, and continuing to do that in our lives. So, well, I hope that everybody has enjoyed listening to our roundtable for this week. We'll certainly have our October articles going next week. Yeah. Is it next week? It is next week. My goodness, where has our year gone? Yeah. And we're coming up on the end of September, and we'll have our October articles out. We will have more in the trenches coming out soon. Hopefully more recorded Bible classes will be coming out soon. We've reformatted for our next year. We've got our topics ready. We'll be announcing those soon for 2024. And we're looking forward to another wonderful year with you to discuss and to think about spiritual things. All right.